The judge turned pale when the boy pulled a camera out of his pocket. The courtroom was eerily silent as the judge adjusted his glasses, glancing over the documents in front of him. The air was thick with tension. Seated at the defense table was Jonathan Carter, a middle-aged African-American man, his hands clenched together, eyes darting toward his 15-year-old son, Elijah, sitting just behind him. The boy's face was solemn, his dark brown eyes locked on his father, as if trying to anchor him to reality. Jonathan was on trial for a crime he swore he didn't commit, a hit-and-run accident that had left a family devastated. According to the prosecution, he had been intoxicated that night and recklessly caused the crash. The evidence against him seemed overwhelming. Eyewitnesses, traffic camera footage, and even a bottle of whiskey found in his abandoned car. Sitting across from him, District Attorney William Hensley wore an expression of quiet confidence, knowing how solid his case was. Behind him, the senator, Richard Calloway, observed with a cold gaze, his fingers tapping impatiently on his knee. As the trial progressed, Elijah felt powerless. His father had always told him that justice prevailed, that truth mattered. But here, inside this cold, unforgiving courtroom, truth seemed like a fragile thing, twisted by powerful hands. At the defense table, Jonathan's lawyer, Michael Stanton, fought back with everything he had, arguing inconsistencies in the case. But each time he tried to push back, the judge, Harold Whitmore, shut him down. It was as if the verdict had already been decided. Then came the moment that sent a chill down Elijah's spine. The prosecution presented a key witness, a police officer, claiming he had seen Jonathan flee the scene. His testimony was delivered with absolute certainty, but something didn't sit right with Elijah. He had grown up listening to his father talk about integrity and truth. And something about this officer's words, they felt rehearsed. Jonathan sat still, his expression unreadable, but Elijah could see it in his father's eyes. Fear, not of prison, but of something much deeper. And that's when Elijah realized this wasn't just a trial, it was an execution. Jonathan Carter sat motionless, his fingers twitching slightly as he stared at the polished wood of the defense table. The weight of the accusations pressed against him like an anvil on his chest. Elijah, seated just behind him, clenched his fists so tightly that his nails dug into his palms. He wanted to scream, to tell the judge, the jury, everyone in that courtroom, that his father was not a killer, but he was just a kid. Who would listen? The prosecution continued hammering its case. Officer David Langley, the key witness, stood confidently in the witness box, delivering his testimony as if reading from a well-rehearsed script. I saw the defendant fleeing the crash site. He was staggering, clearly intoxicated. When we searched the vehicle, we found an open bottle of whiskey. It was clear-cut. Michael Stanton, Jonathan's lawyer, wasn't buying it. He rose to his feet, adjusting his tie before pacing toward the witness stand. Officer Langley, you say my client was seen staggering away from the accident, yet there were no footprints found near the crash site leading away from the vehicle. Can you explain that? Langley's jaw tensed, but he kept his expression neutral. The ground was dry, sir. There wouldn't necessarily be any footprints. Stanton smirked. Dry ground? According to the weather report that night, there had been a heavy downpour just hours before the accident. Shouldn't the ground have been muddy? A flicker of hesitation crossed Langley's face before he recovered. Perhaps I misremembered the condition of the road, but I know what I saw. It was a weak response, but Judge Harold Whitmore immediately intervened, clearing his throat. Move along, counselor. Let's keep this trial on track. Elijah's stomach twisted. Something wasn't right. Every time his father's lawyer tried to poke holes in the prosecution's case, the judge shut him down. It was as if Whitmore was personally invested in making sure Jonathan was found guilty. Then, it was Jonathan's turn to testify. He took a deep breath as he rose from his chair, stepping up to the witness stand. The courtroom felt suffocating. He faced the jury, 12 strangers who held his fate in their hands. I didn't do this, Jonathan said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. I wasn't in that car when it crashed. Someone stole my vehicle. I had nothing to do with this accident. I would never run from a crime like this. Never. Hensley, the prosecutor, approached with a smug smile. Then why was your DNA found inside the car? Jonathan hesitated. Because it's my car. Of course my DNA is there. But why did we find your fingerprints on the whiskey bottle? A heavy silence filled the room. Jonathan's knuckles turned white. That bottle wasn't mine, he said, voice low. I don't drink. The room erupted in murmurs. Jonathan turned his gaze to Elijah, as if willing him to understand. And Elijah did. His father was telling the truth, and that meant someone had set him up. Elijah sat stiffly in the courtroom, watching as the case against his father grew stronger with every passing moment. The jury had already heard from Officer Langley, the forensic analysts, and now a so-called eyewitness, a man named Robert Faulkner, who claimed he saw Jonathan driving recklessly before the crash. I saw the car speed past me, Faulkner said, adjusting his glasses. Swerving all over the road, the driver looked out of control. Jonathan's lawyer, Michael Stanton, stood up for cross-examination. Mr. Faulkner, you claim you saw the driver. Can you say with absolute certainty that it was my client? Faulkner hesitated. Well, no, it was dark, and it happened fast. But I saw the car, and I know it was his. Elijah's heart pounded. How could a man testify with such confidence if he wasn't even sure? The judge, Harold Whitmore, cleared his throat. Let's move on. We have enough evidence without wasting time on vague recollections. Again, another instance of the judge brushing away details that could help his father. Elijah's stomach twisted. Then came the forensic testimony. A young scientist, Dr. Elaine Merritt, stepped up to the stand, her voice professional and detached. We found Jonathan Carter's fingerprints on the whiskey bottle and traces of his skin cells on the driver's seat, she said. But, Stanton interrupted, were any other fingerprints found? Dr. Merritt hesitated. Yes, but they were smudged, and we couldn't get a full match. Elijah caught his breath. Someone else had been in that car. The prosecution, however, didn't seem fazed. They had what they needed: DNA, a supposed eyewitness, and a biased judge to back them up. Then came the most devastating blow. We have a security camera recording from a gas station 2 blocks from the crash. Hensley, the prosecutor, said smugly, it clearly shows Jonathan Carter purchasing alcohol just an hour before the accident. The footage played on a screen, and there it was, his father, standing at the register, a whiskey bottle in his hands. Elijah felt the air leave his lungs. Jonathan shook his head in disbelief. That's not me. But it was him. It was his face, his clothes, his stance. The jury murmured among themselves, and the expression on Stanton's face darkened. The evidence was damning, too damning. Elijah knew his father. He wasn't a drunk. He wasn't reckless. And something about that footage, it felt wrong. As the court adjourned for the day, Elijah sat on the edge of his bed in their tiny apartment, scrolling through news articles about his father's case. His mother had passed years ago, leaving him with only his dad. If Jonathan was convicted, Elijah would be alone. His fingers trembled as he reached into his pocket, feeling the small, familiar shape of his old digital camera. A memory flashed in his mind. That night, the crash, the sirens, the figure slipping into the darkness, unnoticed by everyone else. And then it hit him. He had filmed something important. His heart pounded. He needed to check that footage. Now, Elijah's fingers trembled as he powered on his old digital camera. The device had been with him for years, a gift from his father when he was 10. He barely used it anymore, but he always kept it with him, a habit more than anything. Now, it might hold the truth that could save his father's life. He scrolled through the videos, his heartbeat quickening. There it was, a file time-stamped the night of the crash. He pressed play. The shaky footage came to life on the small screen. Streetlights illuminated a darkened road. Flashing red and blue lights danced in the distance. He had filmed it from across the street, barely thinking at the time, just a kid recording the chaos out of instinct. But as he watched, his stomach twisted. A man emerged from the driver's side of Jonathan's car. Not his father. Someone else. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark hoodie. He stumbled, gripping the door for support, then looked around hurriedly before disappearing into the shadows. Elijah's breath hitched. His father hadn't been driving. Holy! He cut himself off, staring at the screen. He rewound, played it again, and again. The video wasn't perfect, blurry, grainy in the low lie, but the shape of the man, his movements, his hesitation before vanishing, it was clear enough. Elijah had proof. His mind raced. He needed to show this to his father's lawyer. Now? But then a thought struck him. If the system was rigged against his father, if the judge, the prosecution, and even the evidence were manipulated, then how could he trust that simply presenting this video would be enough? Would they dismiss it? Destroy it? Make it disappear? A wave of panic surged through him. He needed to be smart about this. He grabbed his phone and quickly uploaded the video to multiple places: a private cloud, an email draft, even an anonymous online storage site. If something happened to him or the camera, the footage would still exist. Then he hesitated. Who could he trust? His father's lawyer seemed like the logical choice, but Stanton had already been struggling against the court's clear bias. If the judge was truly compromised, if powerful figures were pulling the strings, Elijah needed to go public. Let the world see the truth before it could be buried. With a deep breath, he opened his social media account. His hands hovered over the keyboard. How should he do this? He could post it immediately, but if he did, whoever was behind this might come after him before his father could even be freed. Then, an idea struck him. A news outlet. If a journalist, someone with reach, with influence, published this footage before the trial concluded, the pressure would be overwhelming. Elijah's fingers flew across the keyboard. He attached the video, wrote a short message, and sent it to multiple journalists known for exposing corruption. Now, it was a waiting game. He turned off his phone, but a cold feeling crept up his spine. He had just made himself a target. Elijah had always known that something wasn't right about his father's case. The evidence didn't add up. The witnesses suddenly changed their statements. And most of all, Judge Whitmore, who had seemed fair at first, grew colder with each passing day, as if he already knew the verdict before the trial even began. Late one night, while helping Vanessa organize some of his father's old belongings, Elijah found something that sent a chill down his spine, a note tucked inside a worn leather notebook. It was scribbled hastily in his father's handwriting. Meeting at Langston Club midnight? Whitmore involved? Elijah's hands tightened around the note. Langston Club, he knew that name. It was a private members-only lounge, an elite gathering place for the city's most powerful men, judges, politicians, businessmen. That night, Elijah couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his father's words running through his head. What if there was something there? Something that could prove his father was innocent? Then, an idea struck him. The camera. It wasn't just any camera. It was his father's old Canon PowerShot, a model with a built-in microphone designed to pick up distant sounds. His father had taught him how to use it years ago, saying, "A camera doesn't just capture images, son. It captures truth." At 11:30 p.m., Elijah grabbed the camera, stuffed it into his hoodie pocket, and slipped out into the cold night. Elijah had never been to Langston Club, but he had seen the darkened windows, the polished mahogany doors, the guards standing outside like statues. Tonight, he needed to get inside. He knew sneaking through the main entrance was impossible. Instead, he crept around the back, where he spotted a narrow service alley. Several staff members in black uniforms were unloading supplies from a truck. Thinking fast, Elijah picked up an empty box from the sidewalk and walked with purpose, blending in with the workers. He kept his hoodie pulled low over his face and mimicked their movements. Heart pounding, he slipped through the kitchen doors. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of whiskey and expensive cigars. Muted conversations and the clinking of glasses drifted from the lounge beyond. Elijah kept his back against the wall, his breath shallow. Then he heard it. Judge Whitmore's voice. "This needs to be handled. We already got rid of the first report. If the kid's father goes free, everything falls apart." Elijah's chest tightened. He peeked around the corner and saw them, Judge Whitmore, Senator Aldridge, and Officer Blake, seated in a dimly lit VIP section. They spoke in hushed but urgent tones. "No loose ends," the senator muttered. "We have too much at stake." Elijah knew he had seconds before he was spotted. Keeping his movements precise and steady, he reached into his pocket, pulled out the camera, and placed it between two bookshelves near the lounge area. The camera's lens had a clear, direct view of the men. His hands were shaking, but he had to be sure the audio was good. He adjusted the settings to high sensitivity mode and hit record. Then, He turned and disappeared back into the kitchen before anyone could notice. He waited for nearly an hour, crouched near the back exit, his mind racing. Finally, the voices in the lounge quieted, and he knew the meeting was over. When the moment was right, Elijah sneaked back in and retrieved the camera. He didn't dare check the footage until he was safely home. Elijah locked his bedroom door, placed the camera on his desk, and hit play. The screen flickered, showing the grainy image of the judge and the senator, whiskey glasses in hand, deep in conversation. Their faces were partially shadowed, but their voices were crystal clear. "We had the officer tamper with the dashcam footage. There's no way they can prove the kid's father wasn't at fault now." "If anyone gets suspicious?" someone asked. "Then we make sure they don't talk." Elijah felt nauseous. He had never imagined something this sinister. They had framed his father. He replayed the footage 3 more times, his heart racing faster with each listen. This was it. This was proof. But he knew he had to be careful. If the judge and senator found out what he had, they wouldn't let him walk away unscathed. He had to play his cards right. He had to wait for the perfect moment. That moment would come at the trial. Elijah sat in the courtroom, his fingers tightening around his hoodie pocket. The trial was going exactly as he feared. Twisted statements, doctored evidence, the prosecutor presenting a case built on lies. Judge Whitmore's voice was smooth, too smooth. He thought he had already won. But then Elijah stood up. "Your Honor, I have something to show the court." All eyes turned to him. The judge's face froze. Elijah pulled the camera from his pocket and walked to the courtroom's projector. The moment the screen lit up, everything changed. The video played. The senator's face filled the screen, his voice undeniable. "We had the officer tamper with the dashcam footage. There's no way they can prove the kid's father wasn't at fault now. Then we make sure they don't talk." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Then, chaos. Gasps, murmurs. The prosecutor's jaw dropped. The jury exchanged wide-eyed looks. The judge went pale. He knew what this meant. The bailiff rushed toward the senator, who tried to leave. Officer Blake sat frozen in his seat. The defense attorney looked stunned. And Elijah? For the first time in months, he felt like he could breathe. Justice was finally within reach. The moment the recording ended, the courtroom fell into stunned silence. The weight of the revelation was crushing. Every person in that room, jury members, reporters, spectators, had just witnessed undeniable proof that the trial had been a sham from the start. Elijah stood firm, despite the tremor in his hands. His heart pounded so hard that he could feel it against his ribs. His father, Malcolm, sat frozen at the defense table, his gaze locked onto the screen. He had believed, deep down, that there was no way out, that no matter what, powerful men like Whitmore and Aldridge always won. But now they were trapped. The whispers in the courtroom quickly rose to an uproar. The prosecution team looked ashen, exchanging frantic glances. Judge Whitmore, seated high on his bench, remained motionless, but his face was ghostly pale. His fingers clenched the gavel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "Order! Order in the court!" he barked, slamming the gavel with all the force he could muster. But it was too late. Elijah's lawyer, Vanessa Carter, was already on her feet, pointing directly at the judge. "Your Honor, this evidence proves that my client was framed," she declared, her voice unwavering. "The prosecution's case is built on falsified evidence, on lies, on corruption that goes all the way to this very courtroom. This entire trial has been a miscarriage of justice." A collective gasp rippled through the audience. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads. Court officers exchanged nervous glances, awaiting orders. Senator Aldridge, still seated behind the prosecution, stood abruptly and began moving toward the exit. But before he could take another step, the bailiff blocked his way. "Senator, you need to stay where you are." Aldridge's face contorted with fury. "Do you know who I am?" he growled. The bailiff didn't budge. Judge Whitmore finally found his voice. This video is inadmissible. It could have been tampered with, altered." "Objection, Your Honor," Vanessa interrupted. "This is a direct confession, captured in a single, uninterrupted shot. The defense demands an immediate forensic examination of this footage, and until then, we request that all charges against my client be dropped." The jury was no longer neutral. They knew what they had seen. The foreman leaned forward, his voice steady. "This case can't proceed until this is investigated." More murmurs. Then, from the prosecution's bench, D.A. Harrington stood up and removed his glasses. His jaw was tight, his hands in fists. He had spent months preparing this case, but now it was ruined. And he knew there was only one way out. "The state moves to dismiss all charges against Malcolm Walker." His words rang through the air, cutting through the tension like a blade. Malcolm gasped. Elijah's legs nearly buckled beneath him. It was over. The judge hesitated. He looked at the walls of the courtroom, at the cameras, the journalists, the people watching him sweat under the weight of his own corruption. For the first time in his career, he had no way out. "Motion granted," Whitmore said through gritted teeth. A wave of cheers erupted. Elijah didn't realize he was crying until he felt his father's arms wrap around him. Malcolm held him tightly, whispering, "You did it, son. You did it." Vanessa shook his hand, pride shining in her eyes. She had fought so hard for this case, but in the end, it was Elijah's bravery that had turned the tide. Across the room, Senator Aldridge was surrounded. FBI agents, tipped off by the public nature of the recording, had already issued a warrant. Judge Whitmore looked sick, knowing that his career was as good as over. As Aldridge was escorted out in handcuffs, Elijah made direct eye contact with him. The senator's face twisted in rage. "You don't know what you've done, boy," Aldridge snarled. Elijah didn't flinch. He simply replied, "I know exactly what I've done." By the time Malcolm and Elijah stepped outside, the courthouse steps were swarming with reporters. Microphones were shoved toward them, cameras flashing wildly. "Mr. Walker, how do you feel now that you're free?" "Elijah, did you always believe you'd win this case?" Malcolm lifted his hand and smiled. "Today, the truth won. That's all that matters." Elijah exhaled, finally allowing himself to smile. The weight of the past year, the pain, the uncertainty, it was finally gone. They had fought. They had won. And now? Now, they were free. As Elijah and Malcolm stood on the courthouse steps, basking in the long-overdue victory, inside, the legal system that had nearly destroyed them was collapsing under the weight of its own corruption. Judge Whitmore barely had time to collect himself before federal agents stormed into the courtroom. The lead investigator, a tall man in a dark suit, approached the bench with a grim expression. "Judge Whitmore, you are under arrest for obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and judicial misconduct." The courtroom erupted once more, but this time the sound was one of triumph rather than chaos. Whitmore's mouth opened, closed, then opened again as if searching for words that could save him. But there were none. His gavel, once the symbol of his power, now sat uselessly beside him. Slowly, reluctantly, he stood as the agents took him into custody. His face, once filled with arrogance, was now void of color. He had ruled over countless lives, delivering sentences with no remorse. Now, it was his turn to be judged. Meanwhile, Senator Aldridge, who had already been detained near the courtroom doors, struggled against the agents escorting him away. "You think this ends with me?" he spat. "You think taking me down changes anything?" The agent tightening the cuffs on his wrists didn't even flinch. "Senator," the agent said coolly, "Project Dominium is already under investigation. There's nowhere left to run." Aldridge's face twisted in shock. The name had finally been spoken aloud. Vanessa Carter, standing near the defense table, watched the scene unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion. She had spent years uncovering corruption, but this was monumental. The fall of a senator, a judge, and a hidden operation lurking behind the justice system itself. This was the kind of case that reshaped history. As the courtroom emptied, journalists scrambled to report the breaking news. Judge Whitmore arrested. Senator Aldridge indicted on multiple federal charges. Project Dominium. What we know so far. The floodgates had opened. Back outside, Malcolm turned to Elijah, who was still processing everything. "You okay?" Malcolm asked. Elijah nodded, his eyes still on the courthouse. For so long, this place had represented nothing but pain. Now, it was the site of their greatest victory. "It's not over," Elijah murmured. Malcolm placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Number, but we won today, And that's enough for now. Elijah exhaled, glancing up at the sky. For the first time in a long time, it felt like they could breathe. The battle had been fought, and the truth had prevailed. Judge Whitmore and Senator Aldridge were behind bars. Their web of corruption, their iron grip over the justice system, had been shattered in full public view. The days that followed were a whirlwind of breaking news, investigative reports, and political fallout. Project Dominium, once a whispered conspiracy, was now an undeniable scandal. As authorities combed through files and bank records, it became clear that the rot ran far deeper than anyone had imagined. More judges, prosecutors, and law enforcement officials who had been complicit in the scheme were now under investigation. The Department of Justice, under immense public pressure, launched a full-scale probe into wrongful convictions that had been influenced by the program. Elijah followed it all from home, still struggling to process the magnitude of what had happened. For so long, his world had been small, just him, his father, and the fight to clear Malcolm's name. But now, he had started something much bigger. One afternoon, as Elijah sat in the living room, Malcolm placed a hand on his shoulder. "You all right, son?" Elijah exhaled. "I guess. It's just, I don't know what comes next." Malcolm nodded, understanding. They had spent so much time fighting, surviving, that neither of them had thought about life beyond the trial. But now, with justice finally served, they had a future again. "We get to choose what comes next, Elijah." It was a simple statement, but it carried so much weight. For the first time in years, they had freedom, real freedom. Across the country, the fallout continued. Whistleblowers came forward. Investigative reporters uncovered more names linked to the scandal. In Congress, there was talk of new legislation, laws to prevent another Dominium from ever happening again. Vanessa Carter, now a national figure, had been invited to join a federal committee overseeing judicial reform. She had fought tirelessly to free Malcolm, but she wasn't stopping there. And Elijah? His name had become synonymous with the truth. Schools, journalists, even civil rights organizations reached out, wanting to hear his story. But Elijah wasn't sure he wanted the spotlight. He had never set out to become a symbol. All he had wanted was to save his father. Yet, deep down, he knew he couldn't turn his back on the power of what he had done. One evening, Elijah sat alone in his room, staring at his camera, the same camera that had exposed the truth. It had been his greatest weapon in the fight for justice. But now, it could be something else. He turned it over in his hands, feeling the weight of everything it had captured, and then, for the first time in weeks, he lifted it to his eye and pressed record. People in power hate being watched. A pause. But someone has to do it. He exhaled, a small, determined smile forming on his face. The fight was over, but his story was just beginning. What do you think about this incredible story? Do you believe justice always prevails in the end? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another powerful story like this one. And remember, sometimes the truth only comes to light when someone is brave enough to reveal it. See you in the next story. Subscribe now. Turn on notifications to stay updated.